Joining us now, we have Paul Prescod. He is host of The Jacobin Show, which I have to put a giant plug in for. I think you guys do such great work and such intelligent commentary over there. You can find it on YouTube. Paul is also running to represent Pennsylvania's 8th Senate District. Welcome to the show, Paul.
Thanks for having me.
And also joining us, once again, great friend of the show, Oren, who is Executive Director of American Compass. Great to see you, Oren.
Good to see you, Oren.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely.
All right, so we wanted you guys to talk about a new proposal, Oren, that you have been writing about. And let's go ahead and throw this tear sheet up on the screen. It says, why the U.S. right wants to put workers in the boardroom. A Republican bill that proposes to give labor a new voice is a challenge to vested interests on left and right. You're talking here about a proposal from Senator Marco Rubio that would put a non-voting worker representative onto corporate boards. Can you just lay out for us what that legislation does and what you think it would mean for labor's interest broadly in America?
Sure. I think the starting point is to understand that there's a weird quirk in American labor law that says the only thing you can have is a union. So we have the right to organize and join a union. But if you don't have a union, you essentially can't have any other form of kind of formal cooperation with an employer. And so for a long time, reformers, mostly on the right, but some on the left as well, have said, that doesn't make any sense. There should be other options to still form cooperative relationships. And so what the Rubio bill does, and he introduced it with Congressman Jim Banks, and I think it has about 12 Republican co-sponsors. So there's a significant chunk on the right that's thinking about this. What it says is, management and employees can together agree to set up what they call an employee involvement organization. It's basically a committee to get together and talk about issues in the workplace. And you can do that without a union. And if you do that, if you're a large company, you also have to give workers a seat on the board. So that committee, the workers there would choose somebody to represent them on the board of directors as well. And so it strikes me as a really important innovation. It shows, I think, Republicans and the right of center thinking more seriously about what workers actually want and need. And I think it would be a real step forward for our labor system, which today sort of says, you can have a 1930s labor union or you get nothing.
And so, Paul, you've been quite critical of this legislation. Why don't you go ahead and deliver your case kind of against it and why it doesn't fit a pro-worker perspective from your view?
Yeah, I'll start by saying this. If the choice was between nothing and an arrangement like this, maybe I'd say, okay, this is better than nothing. But looking at the bill, there's kind of no there to me. It's a worker gets a seat on the board that's totally non-voting. And so I think it's kind of delusional and naive to think about corporate giants with all that they're contending with international capitalist competition, the wishes of their shareholders, that they're going to follow the non-binding suggestions of these workers if they have no real mechanisms or leverage to force these changes. I just don't see that happening without actual leverage and actual power. And in this bill, workers don't really have the power to collectively bargain and set standards for their jobs. And also, what is a little confusing about this bill to me as well is that I don't see how this actually changes current arrangements. So employers today, there really are not barriers to them setting up similar type structures in their workplaces. And actually many employers have. Japanese automakers in the U.S. Throughout the 80s and 90s set up what's called quality circles where workers can make suggestions and input, although over time it was realized what they were really doing was getting workers to figure out how they could work harder with less and less people and less supports. I just don't see this actually increasing worker power in any sort of significant way, not like we've seen actual existing real trade unions do, not just in the past, but even today.
Just a quick follow-up on that, Oren, before I get your response, Paul. You said this between the choice and this, then fine. Give us then the ideal version of the Paul Prescod view.
Well, let me say this. So, the post-war period of the roughly mid-1940s to early 1970s, I think unquestionably this was the time American workers had the most power and prosperity in our society. It's really hard to deny that.
Sure.
And this is the same period where union density was at its highest. At its peak during this time, roughly 35% of U.S. workers were in labor unions, most of them in the private sector. and labor unions had big influence in our society. So the more the labor movement has declined, the less of a voice workers have had in the workplace. And I think in that sense, it's kind of pretty simple that, we know the tools that workers have used to build power, and that is strong democratic labor unions. And I think there is a proposal on the table now. And I think if the right was really concerned about worker power, the PRO Act is sitting there waiting for votes. And to be clear, not to let Democrats off the hook, because there are Democrats who are not voting for that. But that has real legislation to make it easier for workers to organize a union, to join a union, to actually increase their power in society. And historically, we have the data, and actually even presently with existing unions, to show this is what gives workers voice. This is what allows them to raise their standard of living in a significant way.
Oren, how do you respond to that? Because I think you'd have to acknowledge, it's fair for people like myself, like Paul, folks on the left more broadly, to be skeptical that Republicans are actually interested in furthering worker power, just given the past 3 decades plus, 4 decades plus of history here. So the concern is, this isn't, if you really cared about worker power, why don't you join up with Democrats in some of the efforts, whether it's the PRO Act or even something that's more limited, that would bolster unions, that would bolster workers' ability to collectively organize? Is this just a way to sort of rhetorically signal that you're pro-worker while not actually bolstering their standing in the workplace?
Well, I think it's a fairly illogical and just sort of ad hominem criticism of the bill to say Republicans historically haven't been for worker power. Therefore, if it's a Republican bill, it must not be good for worker power. I think we have to look at what the bill actually does. And we also have to look at the very important changes that have been underway for some time now on the right of center. And so, I think the problem is that in a lot of our political discourse, and certainly on the left of center, we've taken worker power to be synonymous with big labor and labor unions of this particular type. There are plenty of ways in which Republicans have long been interested in worker power. If you take immigration restriction as an example, the idea that we probably shouldn't be essentially operating an open border and allowing unlimited, low-skilled, low-wage labor into the country is in part an argument about concern for worker power and the leverage that less skilled American workers are going to have in the labor market. Now, unfortunately, Democrats, for other reasons, have no interest in talking about that. But it's, I think, certainly the case at this point that conservatives broadly and a lot of Republican politicians care a lot about worker power. And the question is, what would be the right way to do that? The problem with the PRO Act is that it is just a big labor bill. It is just a bill designed to get more workers into the 1930s style labor unions, with the problem being that workers don't really like 1930s style labor unions. I mean, there's an enormous amount of survey data going back decades that shows that if you ask workers what would they prefer, an organization representing them run solely by workers or one run jointly by management and workers, by large majorities, workers say they would prefer something jointly run. If you ask them whether they would prefer something that has no power but cooperates with management, or something that has power but is opposed by management, workers say they would prefer the cooperation. And then when you start asking them about what unions do today, one thing you see particularly is they cannot stand the way that big labor is involved in politics. Big labor has become an arm of the Democratic Party, and the issues that they push often have nothing to do with what workers actually want. So it seems to me we should be creating a suite of options that let workers organize, that let workers have voice and representation in ways that are going to reflect their own preferences. And I'm not here to say we should get rid of the NLRA, the National Labor Relations Act. If someone wants to organize and form a union, they should have that right. But let's recognize that that's down to about 6% of the private sector workforce. As far as I can tell, there are no recent surveys that actually indicate a majority of workers want to join a union. And under our system, if you can't get to majority support, you don't get a union. So I'd actually end right where Paul started, which is if the alternative is nothing, this is a good idea. And for most workers right now, the alternative is nothing. And so I think anyone serious about worker power and giving workers more options should want to give them this option too.
Paul, let me get your response to that critique, because I think this is actually quite salient. You know, we have the American Compass survey of actual American workers by a 3-to-1 margin there. They say they would prefer a worker organization that focuses only on workplace issues and not one that is engaged in national political issues. They say also, we saw, and this is anecdotal, and we're not dismissing any of the screwery that was happening with Amazon, but there was a frustration by the actual black workers of Bessemer, Alabama, that they were even signaled to about BLM as opposed to actual higher wages, and part why they decided not to vote for a union, at least in that election, given all of the irregularities. So what do you make then of that critique, that big labor is essentially an arm of progressive cultural activism specifically, and that given that it doesn't necessarily represent a lot of worker interests?
Yeah, there's a lot to cover there. Well, first, so going back to that American Compass survey, and so maybe I was reading something different, but I remember clearly the question was asked to those workers in the survey, you know, would you join a union? And a plurality said yes. And the second largest number said they weren't sure. And it was the third largest section that said no. And so that doesn't surprise me. What that shows is, again, the plurality actually would. There's a large section that do not know, which does not surprise me, given that many people just do not know about unions now. But what happens during a union drive? You learn about what a union could do. Now, of course, that's balanced against, you know, what management is going to do on the other side. But, you know, so those numbers do not indicate to me that those workers overall do not like existing unions. And I think to go to this, this issue of unions involved in politics, I think we have to be very clear. It's one thing to say, you know, political legislation that affects workers, and there's another thing to say, for lack of a better term, like woke politics.
Yeah.
And actually, I think the reality of the labor movement today is actually they focus the vast majority of their resources and focus on administering contracts and negotiations. And actually, this is actually something, a critique by many leftists, that a lot of people on the left wish unions in the United States were more political, wish they took on more social issues. But I got to tell you, the reality is that many of them actually do not do that. They do focus on political legislation that affects them, but of course they do. The National Labor Relations Board matters. Right to work legislation matters for workers. So of course they're going to focus on those political issues. Just like the Chamber of Commerce, you know, they focus on their political issues, and they by far outspend labor unions on these political questions. Now, it could be fair to say that, you know, I think unions overall need to do a better job of communicating to their members of why they are getting involved in politics and why certain issues are important. But I got to say, you know, and I take that critique about what happened in Bessemer. I think that is fair. And Jane McAleave, I think, wrote a really good kind of postmortem on that got into some of those issues. But I will say overall, my experience has been that, you know, labor really does focus on those bread and butter issues. And again, for the very small amount of workers that are in these unions, which unfortunately is a small amount, you see the difference. I mean, by far their wages are better, their benefits are better, their job security is better. So even in this period where unions are admittedly on the defensive, are weaker, you know, they still are delivering for many members. And they do that by focusing on those bread and butter issues.
Well, and Oren, you have approval of labor unions at its highest point since 1965. So 2/3 of Americans approve of labor unions. And yet, because you have, companies able to engage in incredibly aggressive tactics and just blatantly flouting the law frequent times, as we saw in the case of Amazon, and as we're witnessing right now in Starbucks, you have a very low level of unionization. At the same time, you know, one of the things that has happened is as Republicans shifted to taking an aggressive anti-union stance, of course, with Reagan and active union busting, of course, labor unions have moved more into the Democratic Party camp. But coming from, you know, having lived in a state like Kentucky, I can tell you still at the state level, there are Republican legislators that support labor unions and that receive labor union support in turn. So isn't part of the problem the fact that Republicans have abandoned the labor movement and given unions no choice but to ally with and side with Democratic politicians who are the only ones at this point, and they don't all consistently do it, but who are the only ones that, you know, really consistently back their rights to even exist?
Well, just as a factual matter, I think you have the history a little bit backward. There were, of course, a lot of Republicans, even at the national level, who were supportive of labor unions right into the 1990s. And it was after the Gingrich takeover in Congress when Republicans suddenly had a majority for the first time, going back to the 50s, I think, that labor unions turned around and said, well, then that's it. We are going all in for the Democrats and abandoned Republican politicians who might have been pro-labor. So that's not to say certainly Republican politicians haven't done plenty wrong as well, but there is plenty on both sides to point to in the problem of polarization that we have today. I think the broader problem, Krystal, with the way you framed the question is that you assume that the labor unions are themselves the interest that's relevant. And they're not. They're supposed to be representatives of workers. So the question isn't what the labor boss wants.
I think that's fair. I think that's fair, but there are some really significant fights going on right now with UAW and Teamsters, two large and incredibly consequential unions that are exactly about what you're talking about, making the unions themselves more representative of the democratic will of the membership. So, why not engage in some of those fights to make labor unions more accountable to their membership, something I would certainly support, rather than providing this alternative mechanism that ultimately, has no voting power on the board and doesn't offer the opportunity for workers to be able to collectively bargain.
Well, I think that's great if big labor is actually now working on trying to more effectively represent their members. It's a shame that that we've come to the point where we have to sort of point to that and celebrate that instead of taking it for granted. But none of that addresses the question of whether other options would be valuable as well. And as I said, there's decades of research now showing that a lot of workers don't want a union, and what most workers would prefer is something more like what's in this bill. Now, I think there's a lot of other things we should also do to reform labor law, but to the extent that we're discussing this bill and should people be voting yes or no on it, it seems to me I'm still not clear what the case is for voting no on it. I've heard a lot of things it could do that are good, that are better than nothing. I think a non-voting board seat is still incredibly important. If you're thinking about how boards work, very rarely is the issue one of a split vote coming down to one vote. It's about who's there, who's participating. It's about building trust. It's about the flow of information. So I'm still waiting to hear why we shouldn't do this.
Go ahead, Paul.
Yeah, what's the case for voting no?
Well, the case for voting no is that it's clear how companies are going to use this. They're going to use this to box out unions and to further weaken their power and to muddy the waters for workers of what true representation is. And again, the employers are currently not prevented from currently doing this. And I mean, maybe I can end on this. I mean, if we want to talk about worker power to really improve their lives, we just witnessed in last year 2 big private sector strikes at John Deere and Kellogg's. These workers fought like hell for something very basic, like increased wages, health benefits, end of 2-tier not working, insane shifts. They fought like hell, and I think they were largely successful. But if they had to fight that hard just for that, do you really think having one worker, a non-voting seat on a board, the companies are going to listen to them? No, they constantly have to fight for these things. And having a union in those situations was the only way they were going to be able to win that fight to at least get, and again, we're not talking about something crazy here, 5% wage increase, no cuts at our health benefits. But that showed us yet again, that was the tool that could get them to win. And I just think it's delusional to think one seat where you can't even vote, that these big corporate giants are going to listen to workers. I've never seen it really in history. I'm not going to see it now, I don't think.
Gentlemen, appreciate both of your perspectives very much. We're going to include the link to the report from American Compass for Oren, and also the link to Jacobin show and Paul's state Senate campaign as well in the description, so you guys can check out more. But thank you both so much for your time, your analysis.
Thanks, guys. It was really helpful.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, our pleasure.
Absolutely. Thank you guys so much for watching. We really appreciate it. We just appreciate your support every day. I was telling Krystal about this. We recently started this TikTok account, much to my chagrin, but the Gen Zs wanted it, so we hired somebody, and he's been running our TikTok account.
Phenomenal.
Excellent job. We've gotten 50,000 followers in just 3 weeks, which I'm told is pretty good by some of the teenagers who I've met before. And all of a sudden, our TikTok account has been locked for 24 hours. And the reason that we're giving Krystal is that we violated violated their community guidelines for hate speech. And the video that they are pointing to specifically is a video where we defend Joe Rogan. Now, I can tell you, and you can go and watch these videos for yourself, we at no time said the N-word. All we said was the N-word, literally.
We didn't say the actual word.
At no time did we utter anything which could be construed as hateful in any way. Now, this is the, I believe, third community guideline violation that we've received on our account in just 3 weeks. I wonder if it has something to do with some of the criticism I've made of the company in the past.
That's psycho.
And it's very clear that the TikTokers themselves are enjoying breaking points there. But look, I say this only as yet again an example as to where we rely entirely upon you with these premium subscriptions. We can be destroyed by YouTube overnight. Just to give people a monetization update, we had multiple segments which were demonetized on our Thursday show, which were not eligible for monetization until hours later after everybody watched it, including the NBC News airing neo-Nazi propaganda, including the CNN Me Too accusation. None of them were available for monetization until hours after, which means that we can't make any money off of those videos. Once again, it's fine because we rely on you, but we're just trying to give you as open of a picture into the forces that you were fighting against. It's all fun and games for the entertainment YouTubers and all those people who are out there. But when we talk about the real stuff, the real news, this is what happens to us.
But we also have some good news for you guys that, again, your support has helped to enable, which is we are going to do a live show for the State of the Union.
Boom. Look at that.
It's happening on March 1st. We're going to do a pre-show. The speech is supposed to start at 9, give or take, so we're going to do pre-show starting at 8. It's going to be me and Saagar, Kyle and Marshall, so the whole realignment, KKF, secular talk team will be right here in the studio. Kyle's going to stream it on his channel too. So we'll do pre-analysis, we'll stream the speech live, and then we'll do post-analysis as well with a couple of special guests. So something we are very, very excited about, something we'll be doing more of this year, and that you guys made possible.
Big news possible, literally only because of your support, because it does cost money in order to put those live shows on. Even more, we're hiring some awesome new people. You're going to see some new faces on the channel. You already saw that Matt Stoller video as well. So look, we do it all, because
you guys are loving the Stoller content.
Yeah, it's doing really well. Even though it was about weed, which once again, whatever. Guess I have to wear pro-weed propaganda on our own channel already. But that just goes to show you, I'm not going to censor anybody whenever we hire them. So there we go. Thank you all so much for your support. We will see you all tomorrow.
Love y'all. Have a good one. Hey guys, thanks so much for watching.
That's right. Just as a reminder, you can become a premium subscriber today. Watch the full show completely uncut, our reactions to each other's monologues. You get to listen to it. You get to ask us questions, all that good stuff. Link is right there in the description or at breakingpoints.com.
Best of all, great way to say screw you to the mainstream media.